The town sat between red earth and tall grass, where dust clung to feet and stories clung to names. Here, people did not ask who you truly were. They asked whose child you were, whose wife you had become, and whether your family name still carried weight. Tradition ruled the mornings and slept beside people at night. Pain was common, but silence was praised. In this town, reputation fed families more than truth ever could. At the edge of the town stood an old compound, wide and heavy with history. Its walls were cracked but proud, built by ancestors whose names were still spoken in low voices. Every room carried memory. Every corner carried control. This house did not belong to one person, it belonged to generations. Whoever ruled it ruled the past and tried to command the future. From childhood, everyone learned the same lessons. Mothers were sacred, like the soil that never stops giving. Sons were taught to bow their heads, even when their hearts were burning. Wives were told that patience was their crown and endurance their duty. A good woman suffers quietly, the elders often said. That is how homes survive. The son of the house learned this early. He was raised to work hard, speak softly, and never question his mother. When she spoke, he listened. When she decided, he obeyed. Even when he felt something was wrong, he swallowed his words. Respect, he believed, was stronger than truth. Silence, he believed, kept peace. His wife arrived with hope in her eyes and respect in her hands. She greeted elders properly, kept her voice low, and carried herself with care. Now she carried a child too. Her body grew heavier, but her steps grew slower. Inside her lived life. Inside her also lived fear she never named. She smiled often, even when her back ached and her heart felt small. The mother of the house watched everything. Once, life had been hard on her. She had suffered in silence, just as she now demanded from others. Over time, pain had turned into power. Love, to her, meant control. She believed fear kept families together. I only correct, she would say. A child who is not corrected brings shame. Around them, eyes were always watching. Neighbors paused their sweeping to listen. Elders noticed every movement but said little. When cruelty passed as tradition, they chose quiet. Silence was safer than truth. Silence was easier than justice. And so the compound breathed with tension. The town whispered. The wife endured. The son lowered his eyes. The mother ruled. Above them all, the unborn child waited, as the old walls held their breath, knowing that silence never lasts forever. The days passed slowly inside the compound, each one heavier than the last. With her belly rounding, the wife moved more carefully, measuring each step as if the floor itself might betray her. The life growing within her made her sacred and vulnerable all at once. And in that quiet reverence, old power began to tremble. The mother noticed the change immediately. She saw the respect others now afforded the wife, the way neighbors whispered about her careful steps, the way the husband's gaze lingered longer on her. Control, once absolute, now felt fragile. Do not think a child will give you more power than I have earned, the mother said one afternoon, voice low but cutting. You will learn your place. The wife bowed her head, a small smile on her lips hiding the dread coiling in her chest. She nodded, not because she agreed, but because silence kept the child safe. Every instruction, every task, even those that bent her body or humiliated her in subtle ways, she followed quietly. Yet each hidden jab, the way her hair was pulled too tightly for hours, the whispered criticisms in the kitchen, the chores doubled under the guise of training, left invisible cuts. In front of the villagers, the mother was careful. Her words were laced with tradition, her voice steady as she corrected, disciplined, advised. But behind closed doors, the tone shifted, carrying sharpness no proverb could soften. The wife wiped her tears quietly at night, while the walls of the house seemed to absorb her pain and echo it back as silence. The husband watched, his heart caught between what he knew to be right and the laws his ancestors had impressed upon him. He had been raised to lower his eyes and carry the weight of obedience, but every day he saw more clearly the harm being done. If I speak, he thought, I dishonor my mother. If I stay silent, I betray my wife. The balance he had always trusted began to crumble under the tension of conscience and tradition. The elders would say, a house stands only when its sons obey and its wives endure. Such proverbs were repeated at gatherings, carried as truth, but hidden within them was a curse. They praised peace, but peace had become the excuse for cruelty. They demanded harmony, but only if no one questioned authority. Outside, the wind whispered through the tall grass, carrying the scent of rain yet to fall. The villagers went about their chores, children laughing in the distance, unaware of the storm brewing within the walls of the compound. Inside, the wife straightened her back, taking another slow breath. The husband's hands clenched and unclenched at his sides. The mother's eyes glimmered with the sharp pride of one who believed she still held power. And in that quiet, the first rumblings of reckoning stirred, waiting for the moment when silence would no longer be enough to protect anyone. The mother watched her daughter-in-law carefully, her eyes sharp and unyielding. "A body that carries life is weak, yet proud," she said, her voice smooth like honey masking a sting. "If you cannot bend to the house, you will break it." She traced a finger across the roundness of the belly, not as care, but as warning. Every step the wife took reminded the household that a new life had shifted the balance, and that the mother would not yield her authority. Strength, the mother believed, was to dominate, and weakness, visible in the curve of her daughter-in-law's womb, was proof that control must be maintained. Each day brought chores that seemed simple but carried hidden weight. She swept the courtyard until her arms trembled, carried water that scalded her fingers, scrubbed the floors on knees that ached, all while the mother supervised. If a wife cannot endure labor without complaint, how can she endure the life she brings into this house? The mother said. Tasks were not just work, they were tests of obedience, designed to break the body slowly, bend the spirit quietly. The wife moved with care, mindful that each misstep could invite public reprimand or whispered shame. Words, carefully chosen, wrapped cruelty in tradition. Proverbs hung in the air like smoke. The river teaches that soft water erodes stone, yet without force, the stone remains, the mother would say as she ordered another laborious task. Every instruction sounded wise, but the lesson beneath was harsh. The wife must be reminded she existed only within boundaries set by the mother. "Do not confuse patience with weakness," she added, yet each correction cut deeper than any whip. Culture had become a weapon, the echo of ancestry turned toward fear. At gatherings, lessons became spectacles. During the weekly compound meeting, she would speak loudly, drawing attention to the wife's mistakes, a dropped pot, a mislaid cloth, a momentary stumble. Neighbors watched, elders nodded, and the wife's cheeks burned as murmurs filled the space. The mother's gaze never wavered. Her smile, slight and satisfied, reminded everyone who held authority. What was punishment at home became spectacle in public, a message sent to all: respect is demanded, and no one dares disobey. Even the marketplace and courtyard became stages for humiliation. A woven basket dropped. The mother clucked and corrected her loudly, in front of traders and children. A misfolded garment. Laughter followed, polite but pointed, and the wife bent under eyes that counted every misstep. Shame became a performance, practiced and precise, stretching the household's power into the streets and alleys beyond the compound. And yet, in every silent gaze, the mother smiled, as if cruelty itself were nourishment. When neighbors averted eyes, pretending not to see, the mother's quiet triumph grew. She had learned long ago the strength in invisibility, the power in endurance, the satisfaction in a hand raised not in anger, but in command. Silence became her ally, and shame her cloak. Through it all, the wife endured. Each humiliating task, each whispered insult, each nodding elder was a weight she carried not for herself, but for the small life within her. She clenched her hands behind her back, kept her voice low, and let her tears fall unseen. Defiance could have meant protection for her own pride, but she chose silence for her child. Each ache in her body, each pang in her spirit, became a quiet shield. She whispered to the unborn, "Grow strong, little one. Mama must bend now, so you may stand tall." And in that patience, hidden and sacred, she held hope, soft, fragile, and unbroken, against the tightening grip of power. The elders gathered beneath the shade of the baobab tree, their shadows stretching long over the compound courtyard. Their voices were calm, measured, each word chosen like a drumbeat that carried weight. "Peace is the river that carries the village forward," one said, nodding to the others. "A son must obey. A wife must endure. Silence keeps homes together." They did not speak of justice or mercy, only of balance and the quiet maintenance of power. In their wisdom, dissent was dangerous. Unity meant keeping one's mouth closed, even when hearts burned. Among the relatives, the whispers traveled faster than wind over dry grass. "She is proud, too bold," a cousin muttered to another, eyes darting to the wife as she passed. "She thinks she can speak. She forgets her place." Pain, the villagers learned, was called arrogance. Tears were weakness. To name suffering was to invite judgment. The wife swallowed her voice and walked with bowed head, feeling the eyes of the compound press against her. The husband felt their weight most acutely. Quiet words followed him when he lingered too long near his wife. "Remember the laws of our fathers," an uncle murmured. "One who challenges the mother of his house brings shame to all before the ancestors. Obedience is the only shield." Every glance, every whispered warning reminded him that courage could be costly, and silence seemed safer than a reckoning. Still, the gossip spread like fire over dry brush. In the market, traders tilted their heads, voices low. "She is difficult," one said. "A woman who thinks herself clever is dangerous." Stories twisted her image, her endurance recast as pride, her gentle words spun into insolence. The village remembered only what was told, not what was true. Even education, once a quiet pride of the family, became a weapon against her. Her ideas, her ways of organizing the home, her questions about the world, all were framed as arrogance, as a challenge to tradition. "She forgets how women should behave," neighbors murmured. "A clever woman can disrupt even the strongest house." And her pregnancy, the gift she carried like a secret flame, became a mark against her. Every ache, every pause, every careful step was noted and reshaped into accusation. "Too slow," some said. "She cannot endure the weight she brings." Life itself was used to blame her, and still she moved forward quietly, her silence a shield for the child inside, as the village watched and whispered, the law of eyes and mouths enforcing power more than any elder's hand. The husband sat on the wooden bench outside the compound, the sun dipping low and painting the red earth in gold. The wind carried the faint cries of children playing in the distance, but the courtyard was quiet. In his chest, two forces waged war, the weight of tradition and the stirrings of conscience. His mother's voice echoed in his mind, long rehearsed and commanding, "A son obeys. A house stands when mothers are never questioned." Yet another voice, softer, urgent, whispered, "She is suffering. You must protect her." His heart trembled at the divide, caught between the world he had always known and the one he wanted to create. He watched his wife move slowly through her chores, each step deliberate yet heavy. Her hands shook slightly as she poured water into a clay pot. Her shoulders slumped under tasks that once would have been ordinary. He saw her exhaustion etched into every line of her body. Her strength, once radiant, now bore the shadow of unseen blows. Even as she smiled at the neighbors who passed, her body betrayed her struggle. Every movement whispered the story she could not speak aloud, and his silence suddenly felt heavier than the work she endured. Later, he met her gaze and froze. The light in her eyes, once bright and warm, was dim, shadowed by fear and fatigue. She tried to hide it, as always, but he saw it. The laughter she forced in the courtyard, the polite nods to elders, the careful attention to her mother-in-law's orders, all attempts to mask the emptiness within. Her spirit recoiled at every command, every public humiliation, and he knew that no task, no proverb, could shield her from this quiet cruelty. The woman he loved was fading before him, and he had done nothing. The weight in his chest grew unbearable. Each day he remained silent, he felt a part of himself breaking. Obedience had always been his armor, but now it was a chain. Could he continue to bow and watch suffering unfold? Could tradition justify betrayal of the innocent? He clenched his fists, the guilt pressing down, a storm heavier than any he had known. Silence was no longer safety, it was complicity. Every step she took in the compound was a reminder that endurance alone would not protect her, and every whispered proverb now sounded like a condemnation of his conscience. He turned toward the family room and noticed the calabash resting on the shelf, its surface cracked along a seam no one seemed to notice. Once it had been whole, a symbol of the household's unity, holding water and seeds alike, but now it reflected the quiet fracture in their lives. Every glance at it reminded him that the household's strength was fragile, and the fissure was widening. The crack mirrored the distance growing between obedience and morality, between silence and action. Outside, dark clouds gathered over the compound. The wind shifted, carrying the scent of rain, thick and heavy, over the fields. The sky mirrored the tension inside him, a weight pressing down over the life growing in his wife, over the house that had demanded so much. Even nature seemed to warn of the storm to come, the unborn child sensing the unrest before words could reach them. The son took a deep breath and felt fate brushing against his shoulder. The choice was his, yet it hesitated, trapped between what must be done and what could be endured. The world offered signs and whispers, the warning of broken calabashes and heavy clouds, yet action still demanded courage. He closed his eyes and listened to the beating of his heart, knowing that silence had carried him this far, but only a decision could determine whether life inside the house would bend under tradition or rise above it. The courtyard brimmed with villagers, elders seated under the wide canopy of the ceremonial tent, drums lying silent at the edges, waiting to announce joy. But the air was thick, and the usual laughter of children and chatter of neighbors had stilled. The mother stepped forward, her robe sweeping the ground, eyes glinting with authority sharpened over decades. "A woman must learn her place," she said, loud enough for all to hear, her voice smooth but cutting like a sharpened reed. "Even a child in the womb does not grant weakness to the mother." The wife stood near the center, her belly heavy and rounded, every step slow, measured, as if the earth itself demanded care. The mother singled her out, pointing with a finger that shook only slightly from age but carried a weight that bent necks. "See how she falters," she said to the assembly. "See how she carries burden without honor. This is the measure of a woman who forgets tradition." Her words rang over the courtyard like stones thrown into still water, splashing shame over the wife, now trembling. The pregnant woman's knees quivered beneath her. Her hands pressed over her belly instinctively, protecting the child no one else seemed to consider. Tears pricked at the corners of her eyes, but she kept her gaze downward, trying to survive the humiliation. The villagers murmured, some glancing away, some nodding, caught in the power of spectacle, unsure whether to intervene or remain part of the ritual of obedience. The husband's chest ached. Fear, once framed as respect, now lay bare in her wide, terrified eyes. He had always taught himself that silence preserved peace, that obedience was the shield of the family. But the fear he now saw reflected in her gaze felt like a blade through his conscience. Every proverb he had clung to, every lesson learned at his mother's knee, now sounded hollow. The line between tradition and cruelty blurred until he could no longer tell which he had obeyed, and which he had allowed. He swallowed hard, the drumbeats at the edges of the courtyard suddenly overwhelming in their quiet stillness. He had stood too long at the edge of action, but something inside him snapped. The breath he had been holding released, and his knees, once bent in deference, straightened with resolve. The household, the village, the elders, none could contain the tide that had begun within him. Silence, until now, had protected no one. The naming ceremony preparations continued around them, but the rhythm felt different. The drums were still, yet their absence sounded louder than any beat, as if the earth itself was waiting. The elders' eyes swept the courtyard, every line and wrinkle carrying centuries of ancestral law. Authority hung heavy in the air, each proverb spoken a weight meant to enforce obedience, meant to bend spirits and shape legacies. The mother, sensing the power she wielded, claimed the circle center with quiet confidence. Her robe brushed the earth, her fingers pointing and gesturing, a master of ceremony and control, blending guidance with intimidation. "Every woman must learn the law of the house," she said, voice warm but biting. "Every son must remember who brought him into this world." The words, meant to teach, landed like stones in the chest of the wife and the husband alike. And then the wife faltered. Her legs gave way beneath her, her hands clutching the earth for support. Her head bowed, tears running freely, not from disobedience but from the weight of endurance pushed past its limit. The crowd gasped, some stepping back, some frozen in shock. The mother's eyes flickered briefly with irritation at the disruption, but she maintained her composure. Silence fell, heavier than any drum. The air itself seemed to press down on the compound, carrying the realization that the moment had passed the line of return. The husband knelt beside her, not out of submission but to cradle what had been broken, her spirit, the trust in tradition, and the fragile equilibrium of their world. Around them, the villagers waited, feeling the tension in their bones. Something irreversible had begun, and the drumbeat that had marked peace now thumped silently in their hearts, signaling that life inside the compound, and the law of the house, would never be the same again. He rose slowly, the weight of years of silence pressing down on his shoulders like a heavy blanket soaked with unspoken truths. Every step toward the center of the courtyard felt like a rebellion of the spirit, though his movements were measured, deliberate. He had learned to lower his eyes, to soften his voice, to let obedience flow like water. But the eyes of his wife, hollow with fear, had cracked that dam. The son who had swallowed his voice for too long felt it rise now, not in anger, not in defiance, but as a force of clarity that could no longer be contained. "Mother," he said, his voice steady, carrying across the hush of the assembly. "Respect is not fear. Fear is not honor." The elders stirred, some eyebrows lifting, some hands pressed to lips. Tradition demanded obedience, but it had never demanded cruelty. His words cut through the air, soft yet unyielding. He did not shout, he did not strike. He spoke as one who had weighed every proverb, every expectation, every gaze that had ever measured him, and found them wanting. The mother's eyes narrowed, but the calm in his voice held her in place. He continued, each word deliberate, a drumbeat of measured justice. "This house is built on tradition, yes, but a tradition that preserves life, not destroys it. A son may honor his mother without silencing truth. A wife may endure without being broken." Around them, the villagers leaned forward, sensing the shift. The hush that had once kept them passive now trembled on the edge of realization. He stepped closer to his wife, placing a gentle hand over her shoulder. "I will not allow fear to dwell in this home where respect should live. Your suffering ends today." His gaze swept over the elders, then his mother, acknowledging the weight of ancestry, yet insisting on moral law above blind obedience. His stance was calm, controlled, unwavering, a refusal to bend under the weight of power while still honoring the order that gave it shape. He spoke clearly for all to hear. "She carries life within her, a child who deserves protection before tradition, before fear, before all old excuses. We will honor that life. And we will honor her." The village could feel the conviction, like sunlight cutting through a storm. The wife, eyes wide, dared to lift her gaze for the first time in weeks. Relief, cautious and trembling, touched her face. He did not curse, he did not shout. He exposed the harm, the injustice, the quiet cruelty that had been tolerated for too long, and he did so with dignity. "We do not raise children in shame. We do not teach obedience by bending spirits. This house will remember today not for humiliation, but for protection, for courage, for justice." And in that courtyard, beneath the wide African sky, the son who had learned silence became the man who spoke truth, not with violence, but with a moral strength that could not be ignored. The power that once ruled unquestioned wavered under the light of his voice, and a new understanding began to take root, a respect born of courage, and a legacy rewritten before the eyes of the village. The courtyard fell silent, but the silence was heavy, not peaceful. Gasps slipped from lips that had never dared speak, and whispers moved like wind threading through the crowd. Elders shifted in their seats, hands folded, eyes wide, yet none interrupted. The air was charged with a tension older than the village itself, as if the earth itself paused to listen. Eyes darted between the husband, standing firm, and his mother, whose usual command over gaze and gesture no longer bent the assembly. The drums, meant to mark celebration, remained still, and even the children sensed the tremor in the moment. The mother's face, once a mask of unwavering authority, tightened. Her lips pressed thin, and her eyes flickered with disbelief. She opened her mouth to speak, to correct, to reclaim the silence she had trained him to obey, but no words came. For the first time, her power could not command the courtyard, and she felt it unraveling in the space between breaths. Her hands, always so certain in their gestures, faltered. Without a single strike, without raised voices, her absolute control began to slip. The son who had spoken truth did not need to raise a fist or shout to fracture authority. His calm clarity, his moral courage, left no room for the usual obedience, and the villagers felt it like a shift in the ground beneath their feet. The mother's influence, built over decades, showed cracks as profound as the calabash broken in a corner of the compound, the symbol of family unity now mirrored in her shaken stance. Tradition and justice stood across from one another under the bright sun. Every proverb, every ancestral expectation, every long-practiced ritual of respect was now in stark contrast to what was right. And yet, none of it was destroyed. The husband honored the lineage and the law, but he placed fairness, dignity, and protection above blind obedience. Respect had been separated from fear at last. She looked at the wife, at the life growing inside her, and for the first time saw herself as others must have all along, a mother who had wielded love through dominance, a matriarch whose cruelty had masqueraded as care. The reflection of her own harshness confronted her, sharp and unyielding. The husband's gaze swept the assembly, then returned to his wife. "We honor the past," he said, voice steady, "but the future is sacred. It will not be built on fear. It will be built on courage, protection, and truth." The village inhaled as one, sensing the weight of his words. He had chosen the future, the unborn life, and the moral compass of the household over centuries of unquestioned obedience. In that moment, the legacy of their lineage shifted, not in violence, not in insult, but in a deliberate act of conscience, and every eye in the courtyard understood that the story of this house would never be the same. The courtyard, once heavy with tension and murmurs, finally seemed to breathe. The husband stepped forward, his hand gentle on his wife's shoulder, guiding her away from the shadows of her torment. Each step she took was slow, careful, but steady, her head held higher than it had dared in weeks. The villagers watched in quiet reverence as she was led toward a small, sunlit garden at the edge of the compound, a place untouched by the weight of cruelty, where the air smelled of earth and blooming hibiscus. Elders emerged from their seats, moving with deliberate grace, their robes brushing the ground. "Let us mend what has been broken," one murmured, his voice carrying the authority of age without threat. Hands were extended, palms open, to guide the community back toward balance. Their purpose was not punishment, but healing, restoring the household and the hearts within it. The husband nodded quietly, grateful that justice and tradition could meet without blood or rage. Inside the compound, silence lingered like a new presence. The mother, once the axis around which all eyes turned, now sat alone in the hall where the sun slanted across the worn wooden floors. The empty space felt hollow, as if the walls themselves whispered of lost power. No approving glances followed her gestures, no fear-bowed heads in her presence. The silence was no longer an ally, it was a mirror, reflecting every cruelty, every sharp word, and every act of control she had wielded. Alone at last, her hands trembled as she traced the carvings on the banister, symbols of her lineage, of honor, of the weight she had carried and imposed. Memories of her own mother's stern eyes and rigid rules came unbidden. She realized, with a pang that cut deeper than any public shame, that the pain she had passed forward had shaped her every action. Tears, unbidden, fell freely. No elder could command them away, no proverb could console them. They were hers alone, the reckoning of a life long trapped in cycles of dominance and fear. The husband stood quietly at the garden gate, feeling the gravity of his choice settle around him. His courage had not destroyed tradition, it had reshaped it. The villagers began to murmur softly, nodding as if seeing a new definition of respect, one earned not through fear or silence, but through protection and moral clarity. He had shown that a man could honor his heritage while defending what was just. The wife, feeling the sun warm her shoulders, drew a deep, steadying breath. Her eyes, once clouded with silent dread, now glimmered with reclaimed strength. She lifted a hand to rest on her growing belly, feeling the life inside, a life that now symbolized hope, not burden. Each heartbeat was a promise of tomorrow, each gentle kick a reminder that her worth, her dignity, and her name were her own again. Around them, the compound seemed to exhale, carrying away old shadows, leaving space for beginnings rooted in courage, balance, and the quiet power of justice. The village square, usually alive with chatter and commerce, held a rare stillness. Eyes that had once turned away now met one another with quiet acknowledgment. "We spoke too little when words could have saved," an elder murmured, his voice carrying over the dusty ground. Families nodded in unison, the weight of collective silence settling like a shadow that had lingered too long. The truth was no longer whispered behind doors, it was named aloud. Silence had been harm, and the village could no longer pretend otherwise. Tradition, long wielded as a tool of fear, was slowly reshaped before their eyes. "Our customs are shields," another elder said, lifting his hand to the sun. "They protect life, honor, and the bonds between us, not destroy them." Heads bowed, the villagers sensing the delicate rebalance between respect and safety. Culture was no longer an excuse for cruelty, it became a guide for care, a framework in which justice and love could coexist. The mother, her hands trembling over the carved wooden railing, listened as her son spoke softly, "Forgiveness is not given freely, but earned. Let it come only after truth has been seen, and harm acknowledged." Eyes turned toward the wife, now seated under the shade of the garden tree, her strength quiet but unbroken. The community understood that reconciliation was not a command. It was a choice that required honesty and courage. The cry of a newborn pierced the afternoon, a sound that carried hope as far as the river's bend. Villagers paused, hearts lifting at the promise within each wail. This child would grow into a world that had learned, a world where cycles of fear could be broken, where the weight of silence no longer suffocated the innocent. Mothers held children closer, fathers straightened their backs, and elders watched with cautious joy. Life had arrived, untainted by old cruelty, and the village felt its first true breath of renewal in many seasons. Under the shade of the baobab, the eldest spoke once more, his words measured and deliberate. "Courage, justice, humility, balance, these are the stones on which we build our tomorrow. Let every child who grows here know that their voice matters, that fear cannot be respect, and that the bonds of family are sacred when held with care." The villagers repeated the proverb softly, a chant that would echo through kitchens, marketplaces, and courtyards, a moral compass for those who would listen, a story ending and beginning all at once.